So look, practice valuations, let's jump straight in because this podcast was spawned off the back of a conversation that you and I had and some things that you told me that were really interesting. So if we go, everybody knows about EBITDA, and we're going to be covering that again as the podcast goes on. Let's go back in time. And can you tell me, before there was EBITDA, before there was these metrics to calculate valuations on practice, how was that done? Because this was the gem for me. This is the thing that got me really excited and said that we should shoot this podcast today.
Fine. Well, yeah, well, it's probably useful at the outset probably to say that I've been doing this for about 20 years. So kind of the potted history that I'm going to kind of give you covers basically the last 2 decades and what's happened over those last 2 decades. Because when I first came into the sector, everyone talked about dental practice valuations as a percentage of revenue. And indeed, they were computing them on a percentage of revenue. And that is largely because they were worth considerably less than what they are now. So typically when I came into the sector, my practice was worth say 30-40% of the NHS. Well, there wasn't an NHS contract at the minute, but 30-40% of the total income, as opposed to the kind of metrics that we see in today's market.
Just seems like there's so many holes in that.
There's massive loads of hope because, of course, it's the age-old adage is what practice would you rather buy? Is that would you rather buy a practice for 200 grand that's making 100 grand a year, or would you rather buy a practice for 200 grand that's making 50 grand a year? Now, everyone's going to buy the practice that's making 100 grand, so why on earth would they be worth the same amount of money? Yet that's how practices were valued.
And what was the logic on that? Was it just for lack of a better system?
It was just a lack of a better system. It was a lack of professionalisation in the market, and it was just the traditions of kind of that's how they were valued. Now, of course, I guess the thing that's probably worthwhile remembering is that when we're talking 30-40% of revenue as a multiple of profitability in terms of where we are now, it was a fraction of the kind of multiples people pay. So that's the reason why there was a lot less due diligence and there was a lot less process involved in buying and selling a dental practice because proportionally the amount of money people paid for them was considerably less than what they pay for them now. So in some respects, it didn't really matter if you paid 25% or 30% because you were probably still getting a good deal in today's money.
Right, understood. So whereas now things are a little bit, well, margins are squeezed a lot more nowadays, so people want to inspect that a lot more before
Yeah.
they make any decisions.
Yeah, if you consider now, I act for people who bought a practice for 100 grand and they're selling it for like a couple of million quid. And it's kind of like, well, why have I got to do due diligence? When I bought the dental practice, we went down to sisters, obviously we shook hands and he just gave me a couple of bits of paper that said how many patients he had. Well, the truth is, if someone's paying you £2 million, the expectation is they get a process which ratifies the value of that asset. When you were paying 100 grand for a business that probably profited somewhere around 200 to 250 grand, is that you're paying 6 months money. In practice, it didn't really matter if there was a 10 grand hole somewhere, because in the grand scheme of things, your payback period would still be probably within that year or two. Whereas nowadays, if people are buying a practice for argument's sake for 7 times EBITDA, even on paper, before we consider the tax element, they've got at least 7 years payback. But in truth, by the time they've paid the tax and by the time they've invested in maintaining the surgeries, you're looking at 10 to 11 years before you've even got to an equilibrium position.
Understood. So it's partly because the valuations are that much more significant nowadays that people just want to look into things a little bit more before they part ways with that level of money, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
In
Yeah. So,
part, in part.
the turning point was twofold, really. And it was all when I first came into the sector, there was only, I think it was 27 or 29, I can't remember off the top of my head, companies that had limited companies that had a license to practice dentistry. And they were some of the obvious names that we all know now. So, sort of the IDH and Oasis Dental Care, as they were, who had two of the licenses and who are now obviously Bupa. Which was a big struggle within the sector, people struggled to borrow money because there was only these 29 licenses as a limited company, which meant that they always had to have unlimited liability, which I'm sure obviously you've covered on a different podcast. Now, what happened is back in 2006, 2007, there was a relaxation of the Dentists Act, which allowed for more dentists to trade as a limited company. And what it also allowed for is it then allowed for shareholders who weren't registered with the GDC to come into the sector and own shares beyond those 29 licenses. And so all of a sudden you had loads more people from outside the sector come into the sector with money, which then enabled which then obviously increased valuations, and as a result changed the professionalisation and the valuation methodology.
Fascinating. Okay, cool. So that's what shifted in 2007, and then how did things evolve since that point?
Yeah, well, as a result of that, there was an NHS dental practice or a group of dental practices called ADP Dental. Now they owned back at that point in time somewhere in the region, I think it was about 36 dental practices. And as part of this kind of change, they got a load of money and they were backed by an Icelandic bank called Kaupthing. And a private equity backer, and they went out and they bought dental practices for what seemed at the time like an obscene amount of money. So you had, at the time we were retained by ADP, and we were writing to dental practice owners saying, "Do you want to sell your dental practice?" And people were getting 115, 120% as a reflection of gross revenue, and that was unheard of at that point in time. So what you had is that they suddenly went from in the 30s number of dental practices to up to 120 odd dental practices when they sold, and that happened over a very short space of time. They would have got a lot more dental practices if they weren't blocked by a load of what at the time were PCTs, which you now know as area teams, because at that point in time, the transfer of NHS contracts had to be granted by the local PCT because we didn't have the partnership route. It kind of wasn't discovered. Now, the partnership route is something which is commonly accepted now, but bear in mind for every practice before then, we had to go to the PCT and say, look, will you allow ADP to buy your dental practice? And most PCTs were like, no, no, don't want corporate dentistry, don't want this, don't want that, and they blocked it and were as resistant as possible. Now, some PCTs were really easy, like Leeds, if I remember rightly, Leeds were a great PCT. They were happy to grant, the transfers, but most were not. And so a lot of the market was kind of held up by sort of a political movement by the PCTs at that point in time, which prevented a lot of those dental practices changing hands.
I see. So really, things started to move faster in certain areas, and then everybody else just it kind of felt like dominoes.
Yes, basically what happened was you had ADP with all this kind of money, and they were getting blocked left, right, and centre. And then you had some really clever lawyers, which is probably right. I should probably reference Russell Abrahams and Ray Goodman, who's both still practicing the sector nowadays, who basically had various different arguments and lobbies, with the PCTs at the time, and gradually got this partnership route accepted, which was then utilised by ADP and IDH, or My Dentist as they're now known, to go out and make acquisitions en masse, and that reopened the market. Now, at that point in time, unfortunately, we did then also go into the crash. So, as I just mentioned, ADP were backed by Kaupthing, an Icelandic bank. And of course, those of us who were around at that point in time might remember that Iceland were particularly badly hit when we went into the crash. And Kaupthing's money basically dried up overnight. So ADP couldn't make any more acquisitions, almost just as the tide was turning that got to sort of get rid of this legal blocker. Um, and then what happened shortly after that in 2011, because basically ADP at that point basically slammed the brakes on because they didn't have any money. And then IDH bought ADP in 2011, in essence, to remove their biggest competitor from the market to allow them to control kind of what the pricing was in NHS dental practices. So at that point in time, we had this kind of period between 2006, 2008, where there was almost this ramping up of goodwill, particularly on the NHS side, and I'll come back to private in a second. And then we had this kind of lull where kind of IDH was still acquiring, but ADP didn't have any real money. But then we also had loads of people who were kind of going, well, hang on a minute, if IDH are doing this, and if ADP would have done this if they didn't have problems with Iceland, then you started to see the emergence of other kind of smaller developing kind of groups, so Southern Dental, who people will now potentially know as Coliseum, potentially one of those in that period of time. And they started to come up the ranks. So, and at that point in time, that's when we started to see lots of acquisitions and M&A activity within the market. But to go back to referencing that as a percentage of turnover, of course, the reason why ADP in particular was so keen to make acquisitions en masse is at that point in time, they were only paying 4 times EBITDA for the practices. Now, a lot of the practice owners, because EBITDA wasn't really a thing in the market in sort of 2006, 2007, is it looked like they were getting mega money for their practices. But actually, in reality, in comparison to today's money, they were only actually getting 4 times EBITDA, which is very cheap. Even if you go outside the dental space, there's not many kind of businesses you can acquire at 4 times EBITDA that have an NHS contract that is a fixed income, and that's why they were buying them or wanted to buy them so rapidly at such a price.
Makes sense. So relative to other industries, these businesses had fixed income. They were only 4 times EBITDA, which in other industries you would have paid a premium for. So they're getting hoovered up.
Yeah, and I guess that's the other case in point is there was two events that happened in this period, because of course we still refer to it colloquially as the new contract in 2006, which kind of everyone, unilaterally across the dental space kind of disliked the new contract, but of course it's not very new anymore. We're in 2024. But what that contract did is, prior to that, you had a load of people who you could just open an NHS dental practice. So if you found a high street location and you got all the right permissions, the PCT just gave you money based on what you delivered. Whereas as we went in 2006, they wanted to be more control over budgets. People had to get and were issued with an NHS contract, which basically removed new entrants in the market, which created this fixed income, which is why we saw, at the same time we saw the relaxation of the Dentists Act, so much interest in the sector, because all of a sudden people had a guaranteed income into their business as long as they did the amount of NHS activity they were contracted to deliver.
Right, I see. So that's when we started to see EBITDA being
Yeah.
introduced as more of a concept.
Yeah, it was a perfect answer, because of course what that contract also did is it allowed for profitability on NHS dental practices in particular to increase, because we still have it in private practices where we have fee split arrangements in the main. And traditionally that fee split was always 50%. And bear in mind there was always a dental recruitment issue in some cases, in some harder to recruit areas, which we now refer to as dental deserts. People were paying 55% of NHS income just to get an NHS dentist to come and work in their practice. Whereas when we had the new contract come in, people were being given £27, £28 UDA, but they were only paying the dentist £9 to £10 UDA. So what we also saw is an increase in profitability in NHS dental practices, because instead of paying 50% of the UDA value, what a lot of kind of savvy principals did around that point in time is they negotiated with their associates and paid them on a per UDA rate, which 8 times out of 10 wasn't 50% of what the practice was being paid.
Very nice. Very, very, very nice. Of course, maybe not so much nowadays. You have to incentivize those dentists to do NHS nowadays a little more, right?
Yeah, and it was always a little bit Machiavellian, because, of course, at that point in time, people didn't know that all of this information could be a change in the public domain. So you had lots of principals that were going to their associates saying, well, the government are only paying me £20 UDA, so I can only pay you 10. And so they thought that associates were almost, to an extent, being misled, thinking they were getting 50%, whereas in reality they weren't. And that's what created this kind of profitability, if you like, and a shift in how we think about it, because we don't think about it in NHS terms anymore as a straight pound per UDA, as a straight percentage. We think about it as a pound per UDA. So NHS now isn't paid on a percentage fee split; it's paid on a pound per UDA basis.
There we are. Okay, good stuff. So we've seen how things evolved. So we started out at 4 EBITDA was considered the going rate, and how did
Yeah.
things shift since then into the 2010s, the 2020s, everything along those lines?
So what we saw over that kind of that, if you like, that movement from sort of like 4 or 4.5, to kind of where we sit today, is we saw a gradual increase over the years, and that's where kind of NHS for a long time was the king of the market, because of this ability to create EBITDA by, in some respects, not paying the associates 50%. Now, and that kind of changed over and that probably maintained right the way through the sort of the early 2010s. And it's only really as we kind of got to sort of 2015-ish, 2016, where you started to see the practices were starting to struggle to recruit NHS dentists. At that point in time, people were looking at the market saying, well, actually, do you know what? Private practice seems to be taking off. Obviously, that was around the kind of time where there's some of the big sort of consumer brands in private dentistry, such as Invisalign, were starting to get a little bit of traction. And there was this interesting kind of private practice. So then you saw, the emergence of some of the bigger private groups. Now, don't get me wrong, this happened done before. We obviously had James Hull, who were kind of, around probably the early adopter of mass acquiring private practice. But then they weren't deemed, when obviously they were then lastly sold to private equity, kind of the rules came off, and a lot of their practices were either sold off cheap or they were sold back to the original principals. But then we saw this almost escalation over this kind of late sort of 2010 period, from sort of 4.5 up to 7.5. And it's probably fair to say there were leaps and bounds in that. And then there started to be a diversification depending on geography. So you started to see practices in London and Birmingham, for argument's sake, start to command a heavier multiple than what you might get in, say, areas such as Middlesbrough or Newcastle. But even still, you still saw lots of people coming into the market, because at this point in time, you then started to see the emergence of lots of individual kind of groups sort of below that kind of big corporate sector. So you started to see the emergence of people like what we now know as Demira, Perfect Smile, all of them were being supported quite heavily by sort of debt funding, often by Santander at this point in time, because I think Santander realised that actually we haven't really had a casualty in the dental space. It was quite a safe to lend sector, or what the banks refer to as a green light sector. And whilst you've got more competition, this continued to see the bubbling away, where the multiples gradually continue to escalate, until we've sort of got sort of the late sort of 2010s, where the market started to flip towards private as recruitment became a bigger challenge.
Interesting. And I've got a question, and this is maybe slightly off piste, but I'm going to ask this anyway. So, from my understanding of the GDC regulations, even to this day, in a practice or when you've got a limited company, which owns a dental practice, then you have to have at least 50%, at least 50%, I believe, of the owners have to be registered with the GDC, right? Of the company.
That's a common misconception. Is it's
Oh.
50% of the directors have to be registered with the GDC. So the ownership doesn't make any difference. So I'm not registered with the GDC. I can own 100% of the share capital of a limited company, but the majority of the board have to be registered with the GDC. Now, not registered.
Right. Because that never
I
made
mean,
sense to me. Because I was like, but how does IDH do it then? Or how do like all these other guys do it?
so that's where the misconception is. And when we say the majority, there is a generally accepted principle that 50-50 is okay. Because what you have is your husband and wives, where often, the wife or maybe the husband, isn't registered with the GDC, but for tax purposes, they are both directors and they are both, equal shareholders. As long as 50% of the board is registered with the GDC, then that's acceptable.
I see. So these big guys, these corporates, 50% of their board is
Then
our dentists, our clinical.
registered with the GDC, so that means they can be dental nurses, they can be dental therapists, don't necessarily need to be dentists.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, we wouldn't want to comment on specific companies, of course, but and how they've kind of got around it, but that's the parameters that they've had to navigate, and they've obviously found a way to do it, basically. No, I was always interested in that because I'd heard that being thrown around, but then I was like, what doesn't stack up to me is how you can have corporates then in that case. So yeah, I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, no, that's how it works. And then I suppose the one thing that is a slight nuance to that is in terms of the NHS contracts, because a lot of the NHS contracts are held outside of the limited company. And whilst you can have someone who's registered with the GDC on the NHS contract, they can't, a dentist has to hold the contract. So in the event that, for argument's sake, you had, argument's sake, a dental nurse and a dentist on the contract, if the dentist was to pass, then technically that contract then becomes, there's a Latin term which now escapes me, but I'll use a simplistic term, illegal. So the dental nurse can't hold the contract. And normally there's like a lay period. And it's only about 14 days, I think, from memory, where then that contract has to move back into a dentist's hands, or it has to be technically terminated.
There we are. Fun fact. Okay, great stuff. All right, so we've talked about how EBITDA has shifted with time, and you also said something else interesting there. Just one thing I picked up on. You said, or at least my interpretation of what you said was, you can tell me if this is correct or not. It sounded like geographically nowadays is a factor in EBITDA, right? It's like north, south, all of that. It sounds like that wasn't so much of a thing back then.
No, because I think there was so much land grab at that point in time, is that really it didn't necessarily really matter where the practice was. Because you had all of the big groups who were all quite keen. Now, some of the savvy purchasers, don't be wrong, kind of could see down the road what was coming, that dental recruitment wasn't going to be easy forever. But you did have a lot of land grab, and there wasn't a lot of variation in multiples across different geographies.
I see. Okay, cool. And that brings us pretty much up to the current day, unless there's anything else you feel might be
Yeah.
pertinent or relevant.
So basically, by the time we went into COVID, we had a place where basically private dental practices, in valuation terms, had overtaken NHS, because of the issues around in recruitment, and because a lot of people wanted to be able to soften their multiple by growing the business post completion. So then, as we went into COVID, of course, what happened is the NHS dental practices got pretty well looked after. I know there might be an element of debate on that, but in the main, they certainly got better looked after than private dental practices did. And so when we came out the back of COVID, what you saw is, from an independent market perspective, is you saw a massive interest in smaller practices, because associates, particularly those that trade as limited companies, got, let's be honest, sweet FA and COVID support all the way through the that period of time. And they in essence had 4 months of work where they didn't get paid at all. And a lot of people felt that potentially they've been shafted by their principal dentist. So as we came out the back of COVID, when we all came back to work on the 24th of June, is that we saw literally, we were inundated with people who wanted to buy dental practices who'd never considered it before. And they were buying sort of the smaller dental practices, but also they wanted to buy kind of NHS dental practices in the same breadth. And then some of the kind of mid-tier groups at that point in time who had maybe skewed towards buying more private practices, then slightly diversified back again or rode back again and said, actually, do you know what, we want to buy something that's more mixed. So for argument's sake, if this situation was to happen again, then we've got the backbone of a dental plan or the backbone of an NHS contract that gives us a bit more support.
I see. So that's what you're seeing at the moment. You're seeing mixed practices be the ones that are most in demand.
Yeah, so if I was to drop a promo for 5 seconds, if you were to read our mid-year goodwill report, you will see that the biggest multiples are paid for mixed dental practices, not purely NHS dental practices and not purely private practices.
Interesting. Okay. And that sounds like a fun thing to segue into next. So we've got fully private. There's never really fully NHS. There's always like 2% private in there, but let's just consider it like 90% and above,
When
something
we
along.
but when I talk fully NHS, for the purposes of our reporting, we mean sort of practice which is more than 80% NHS. So that allows for that kind of that 20% differential.
Okay, brilliant. So you've given us a little bit of a dichotomy that we can use there. Excellent. Okay, nice. So let's consider mix to be anything that's 80% and under NHS, right? Yeah, is the way we're going to roll with it and not fully private, right?
Less than 80% private and less than 80% NHS. That kind of middle point is mixed.
Less than 80% private and less than 80% NHS. Oh, okay, okay. Oh, I see, right? Because at the other end of the scale, you've considered even the 20% privacies are pretty much 20%
Yeah,
NHS practices are still pretty much private in your eyes, or that's the rules that you used
yeah,
anyway. It's just as long as the system's consistent. Okay, so between 80 on one side, 80% NHS and 80% private on the other, there are mixed practices. Let's just drill down into that because this could be fun, right? So the
yeah,
multiples are generally higher in here. That's what the research says. And of
yeah,
those practices, there's always 80-20, right? You know the 80-20 rule?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
there's going to be 80, there's 80-20 of flipping everything, right? So even in that little proportion right there, there's still going to be some outlying practices that seem to achieve higher valuations. What do they look like in that mixed category?
Well, it mix the ones that kind of get more, are ones where often there's something left on the table. So it's where sometimes you've got a deflated EBITDA because maybe the business isn't doing what it should be doing, and that might be because they've got too many staff. It might mean that they've got a totally untapped revenue stream. For instance, they're not offering Invisalign, or they're not offering implants, or they're referring out a load of work, which seemingly to a naive person go, well, why would you refer it out? Why aren't you doing it yourself? So it's where, or sometimes it can be a lifestyle business where, for argument's sake, you've got a guy who's working 2 or 3 days a week, has no interest in taking on associates, and has decided that's all he wants to do. Whereas actually, the moment someone steps in, they are going to pay. They are going to be able to open 5 days, and they're going to be able to grow that business. And it's a really easy business to grow, and that's where people pay premiums because you get competition on those kind of practices.
Right, so people are more savvy to that now. They'll pay a premium for the ones they can grow, which makes sense because the profit's going to be lower, right? And that's why you can grow them. So therefore, the multiple is going to be higher, but you still pay less overall, presumably, maybe.
Yeah, because the argument is you can dilute your multiple more quickly. So for example, if you buy a practice that's doing 100 grand a year EBITDA and it's turning over £1 million, that's 10%. That's really low. I would expect an EBITDA typically for most practices to sit somewhere between 16 and 25% as a reflection of revenue. So if someone's doing 100 grand a year EBITDA and £1 million revenue, you look at it and go, well, why? And if there's an easy answer as to why, then that's where you see, if I said, for argument's sake, a mixed practice, you'd get 7.27 times EBITDA. So in theory, that business should be worth 720 grand. Then actually, quite often would sell the business for 800 or 900 because as a percentage of revenue, it looks cheap, and people still think like that, even though that's not the methodology. But also because they know that 100 grand can quite easily become 200 grand if they just sorted out what the problem is underneath it.
Brilliant. Wow, interesting. Any more
Well, obviously,
reasons
geography.
any more
So
things to look out for?
yeah, so the first thing is depending where you want to buy, is that if you're buying a practice in North London or Hertfordshire, you are always going to pay a massive premium because there's so much competition and there's so much family money in that sector. Whereas those that kind of go, well, actually, within an hour I can be in Colchester, then that's where often you can pick up a much cheaper practice for exactly the same metrics, just purely based on kind of geography. And the biggest thing a lot of people lose money on, which people are becoming more savvy to, is hygienist occupancy. Is where, for argument's sake, you've got hygienists who pay guaranteed hourly rates, but actually the hygiene book has got 40% white space. And that's something, particularly if you've got self-employed hygienists, you can flip within a month or three of buying a business and can unlock massive EBITDA.
Wow, I see. Just by doing some marketing, presumably.
Marketing just by changing the association enumeration to a percentage fee split, even if you pay them slightly more per appointment, and often people find that sorts out the occupancy itself, because actually suddenly if the hygienist it matters to the hygienist that they've got half an hour white space at 11:30, suddenly they are a lot more proactive in terms of getting a patient in the chair, or jiggling their appointment book around so that that maybe they finish at 4:30 as opposed to 5, so that they can make the most of their day.
I've heard people, some of my friends who purchase dental practices quite regularly. They've got like 4 or 5 under their belt, and they say what they look for. One of the hallmarks they look for is paper notes and analog X-rays, right?
Yeah.
Because they just know it just says quite a lot about the practice itself. It's kind of like, yes, that's what the headline says, and that's what the body of text says. But reading between the lines, if they've got that, there's probably tons of other things they can improve as well. What do you
Yeah.
think to
Yeah.
that philosophy? You've probably come across that before.
Actually, yeah, because the chances are if they're doing that, they're also not remarketing to their existing patient base. So they're not doing their recalls properly. And then likewise, they're not doing things like promoting Invisalign or implants or teeth whitening, because they've not got it all on a mailing list of their MailChimp and stuff like that, which is really, really cheap marketing, but actually can make a massive difference in terms of patients through the door.
Boom. Just curious, what sort of multiples are we looking at for praxis, like the ones that you just described? So the opportunities, the gems that are mixed praxis.
Again, it all depends on kind of geography, but if you're looking for practice which is significantly underperforming, often that multiple is about 1 times higher than what the market would be, because people pay a premium on top. So for example, if I said a mixed practice was 7.2 times associate-led EBITDA, you might be paying 8.2 times for that business, but you would expect that a multiple could be diluted within 6 months of acquisition.
I see. Food for thought. That's certainly interesting. What about associate led?
That's kind of a friend, and that's where the opportunities lie for the independents and for some of the smaller groups. Because if you were to go and talk to a big corporate, they will only buy them based on what's on paper right now. Whilst they may look and go, oh yeah, that's really easily done, their boards will not let them pay a premium for that practice, because, put simply, the numbers aren't there and there's no guarantees they will be able to do it. Whereas if you're a local practice owner, who can go and make those changes personally, and I've seen it so many times. In fact, I've got a guy who I'm now selling his 8th dental practice, where he's bought practices, turned them, and flipped them within 2 to 3 years. Because he will buy the business, he'll pay the extra turn on the multiple, but then he'll make all the changes in a couple of years, and then he's back out shifting them, sort of, often a £1 to £2 million profit, within that a very short space of time.
See, that's so valuable to know, because obviously the majority of people who are listening to this podcast are going to be associates or principals or independent practitioners, right? And yeah, to know that the corporates are not even necessarily interested in these because, well, it represents, I guess you could say, to paraphrase what you just said, to them, it represents too much of a risk or maybe too much legwork is
Yeah.
one way of saying it. Yeah.
Because it might, they might do it and it might not happen. Now, most of us will go, well, yeah, but all you've got to do is that. So of course it's going to happen. But that's not how these private equity, boards think.
Well, there you go. They're not going to start the Instagram, for example, right? Like, they're just not going to do that, right? That's more where the young guns come in. Oh, but it doesn't even necessarily have to be anything to do with the age. It's where the independent people are going to come in, right? Yeah. Not that it's all about Instagram, but that can be one area where people are massively lacking. Associate led. Someone told me something really interesting about associate led. They said that out of all the the transactions that they've ever brokered, only about 10% of practices are associate led when they're owned by people who are independent. Outside of corporates, obviously they all are. That's a different kettle of fish. What do you think to that?
I mean, of course, I don't know the actual metrics. It's not something we measure internally, but anecdotally, I'd even say that sounds high.
Wow. Wow.
It's quite rare that we get approached, for an opportunity where they've already turned it into a turnkey business. I would say in the vast majority, to some extent, there is still a principal dentist and they're doing at least a day or two a week. It's quite rare that we see associate-led opportunities if they're owned by someone who owns between 1 and 3 dental practices.
Because that's what people get hyped about nowadays. Because everybody wants passive income in inverted commas. So that's what people get excited about, right? But to actually make that happen is and get it to work and get the numbers to work is so flipping rare. Like literally 10% of the time. Easier said
Yeah.
than done.
And it'll be interesting to see how that changes. Of course, going back to kind of what we were, provisioned to talk about the, the history of goodwill and where we go from here, is of course what's happened over the last few weeks is massive changes to taxation and capital gains. Whereas before, where you've got people who own a dental practice, and even if they're doing a couple of days a week, say they're making a couple of $100,000 a year out of it, and they're looking at it and they're going, okay, well, I get running dental as a hassle. Yes, okay, there's a risk because my associate could leave, but I'm still making $200,000 a year. Now, if someone pays me, let's to make the maths easier a second, they pay me 7 times EBITDA for that business, which means I'm getting 1.4 million. And on that 1.4 million, the first £1,000,000 I'm paying 10% on, and the other 400,000 I'm paying 20% on. So from that perspective, is that their tax bill is relatively low. So when you kind of balance it all off, you go, well, okay, if I continue to own it, I'll pay income tax. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, well, my 7 times EBITDA is basically about 10 years' money after tax if I owned it. So I'll sell. But what we've had over the last sort of few weeks is suddenly that CGT on that balance of 400,000 has gone to 24%. And suddenly, what will happen over the next 18 months is that 10% bit, that first million, is going to 14% at the beginning of April and then to 18% the following year. And what I think we'll see more of is we'll see people go, well, actually, the benefit of me selling versus the benefit of me holding, if I can get the numbers right, I'll hold. And I'll try and run the business myself, and I'll try and make it a turnkey business or an associate-led business where I don't go in and out very often. And some of that might be that I'll pay a really good manager. Some of it might be that they'll give the associates a little bit more to kind of lock them in. So there's the incentive for them to be eyes on the ground, so to speak. But it'll be really interesting how that behaviour changes. But I think in 18 months' time, we will see less dental practices come to market because we will see people hold them in lieu of the fact that actually from a value analysis, there's more benefit to holding than there is benefit to selling. And that might have an impact on goodwill because what we might see is basic economics supply and demand. If there's not enough stock coming to market, then you would expect that the value of that stock will go up. So that will be interesting to see what happens. If conversely, we might see a slight downgrade in the next 18 months because there'll be more people coming to market sooner because they think that they want to sell before the tax changes. I'm not so sure about that because I think the amount of what we sell these assets for is 40,000 extra tax. Because on the average dental practice still sells for about 1.1 million. So most people, the tax change is worth about 40,000 to them, give or take. Is that whether that will sway people's behaviour? I'm not so sure it will. But I do think kind of afterwards we will see more holding. Also, because if whilst I don't want to get into politics on this particular platform, is that there is a perception that actually this might be a one-term Labour government, and if it is a one-term Labour government, is that will CGT go back down again if the Tories were to be re-elected? So is it worth holding for those 3 years to see if actually in 2 years' time I can get out and pay slightly less tax anyway?